need a Bible this morning, you forgot yours, you want to follow along, raise your hand. Zeke is waiting to pass out some loaner Bibles. I'm really surprised and I'm blessed because I know how many people are out sick today. There's a lot of us who are not here, and yet this place is still pretty full compared to how it usually is. So I'm blessed that some people braved the weather and came out knowing all the bugs that are going on. Nobody needs a Bible, huh? And that means you all either have it memorized or you brought your own Bible. That's great. I love that. Genesis chapter 21. Now, just to bring us up to date and, kind of remind you where we were last week in case you weren't here, or maybe you were here and need a reminder. The Lord is continuing a process in Abraham. And that process is called consecration. Consecration. And an important thing about the subject of consecration that we need to remember, because I think sometimes we get this wrong. Consecration is not meant to get us out of the world. I think we often think that. We think consecration is about keeping us from worldly things. It's not about that at all. If it were about that, God would do a rapture right from the moment we get saved, and we just would not be on the earth anymore. Consecration is not about getting us out of the world. Consecration is about getting the world out of us. Worldliness, fleshly thinking, fleshly actions and thoughts, those kinds of things need to come out of our hearts and our minds. We need to dwell in this world, but not be of this world. And Abraham still has some worldliness in him. And so you remember last week, God led him, apparently, we're not exactly told why Abraham left the promised land, Canaan, and headed down to this place that is owned by the Philistines called Gerar. But let's look at that real quick as a way of reminder, and then we'll go forward. Abraham had just watched, remember, from the tops of the mountains in the promised land of Canaan, as he looked down around the then fertile plains of the then Dead Sea, or of the now Dead Sea, he watched this smoke build up as God had poured his wrath out upon the sin, the worldliness, the fleshliness of Sodom and Gomorrah and the other three cities in those fertile plains. And, we see the judgment of God, and certainly day after day, as Abraham looked out over those plains and wondered about his nephew Lot, what had happened to him and his family, and as he looked and watched, and remember how I mentioned last week, what this makes me think of is how many days after 9/11 we would see on the news smoke rising up from New York City, from Manhattan. And I just think, man, Abraham was looking out over the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and all those cities there that were so steeped in sin that they were unsavable. They had gotten past the point of salvation. And he saw that, and what was it about what his eyes laid hold of that caused him to think, well, let's pick up this. Remember, not just his family. Abraham picking up and moving is a whole village. He probably has well over 1,000 people under his control at this point when he does this, and back in chapter 20 last week. And he goes to this land, and remember, we found some meaning as I looked at Nelson's encyclopedia, and I looked up the meanings of these words. He ended up dwelling in Gerar. Nelson's encyclopedia calls the meaning of the word Gerar a halting place, a place of halting. You think of the German Gestapo, the SS, halt, halt. It's stop. Remember we talked about what it's like trying to get through Bricktown at rush hour. It's a halting place, and yet here's Abraham at Gerar, a halting place, and it says there it included the names of the places that were around him. Shur, which meant enclosure. God enclosed him or surrounded him, kept him pent in, and then Kadesh, which is where we get the idea of consecration, Kadesh Barnea, as the Lord brought Abraham face to face with the worldliness that still dwelt in his heart and in his mind. And the Lord was trying to draw that out because God was still wanting to bring about the promise. Remember? In your seed, the whole world will be blessed. Not through the bondwoman, as we're going to see, but through the free woman. Not through the bondwoman. Not through Hagar. Not the work of the flesh. That's the worldliness. I'm still trying to get that out of you, Abraham. And so you have to go and dwell in the world so that you can see your worldliness. Today we come to chapter 21, and now Abraham and Sarah are at a place where, God is ready to complete his promise to them. And his promise to them, remember, is a promise to all of creation. But I can't help but wonder as I think about this moment where we're at here in the history of God's covenant with Abraham and to us. I can't help but wonder what it would have been like, how it would have been different if all along as Abraham spoke, or as God spoke to Abraham, if Abraham would have obeyed. We're going to see, as we get into chapter 22, as we get to the end of chapter 21, how Abraham now begins to obey. He gets up early the next morning and he prays, and he gets out and he does what God says. First thing. But if you remember the beginning of God's relationship with Abraham and his calling and his development and his character and those things, it took him a long time to obey God. He was still living in the plains of Mesopotamia when God said, get out of the land, come away from your people, to a land that I will show you, and I will make a great nation out of you, God said. What did he do? He waited. He moved with his father, he moved with his family, he went up and followed the Euphrates River to well north of Canaan, and then he dwelt there for a while, and then eventually God reminded him, I'm calling you away from your family and away from this place. And finally he came out. And not only did he come out late, but he didn't wholly come out himself with his whole heart obedient to God. He brought his nephew with him. He loved his nephew, I guess. But it's so hard, and it's this process that happens in the life of a believer. We obtain this relationship by faith, but it's this process where God is consecrating us. He's getting the world out of us, where our obedience is more like we get up the next morning first thing, and yes, Lord, okay, let's go. Not where it takes weeks and weeks and months and years for us to obey and to follow. Well, let's look at chapter 21. The Lord visited Sarah as he said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. Now, if you want to do the math, it works out to 25 years after he told Sarah he was going to do this for her. Bring about a child from her womb. 25 years later. Are you growing weary about God's promises in your life today? Is there something that's got you frustrated and you said, I thought the Lord said this? Think about Sarah and Abraham. In verse 2 it says, Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. Now that's interesting. At the set time. Who set the time? The Lord, right? And so while we always have a tendency to look at our watch and say, Lord, you're late. I'm drowning. He says, no. You still have a few moments left. I need to get more flesh out. I need to get more of the world out of you. You need to feel like you're about to drown just for a little while longer, because if I take you out now, you're just not ready yet. There's a set time for everything. And God knows when and what is best for us. It's more about us learning to trust him, isn't it? Doesn't that take time? It takes time. Verse 3. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. You might remember God had given him that name because the name Isaac meant laughter. And when God had first given him that name, it was sort of, there was a little bit of a sting to it. You know? Remember, God changed Abram's name to Abraham. He said, Father of many nations, Abraham. That's what you're going to be called. Yet he had to live for 25 years with this name that meant Father of many nations, and he didn't even have one child. It was a little embarrassing to go around your village and say, God just changed my name last night. He wants me to call myself. He wants everybody to call me Father of many nations. They're all going, but you don't have any kids, Abraham. I'm going to call you Father of many nations. A little bit of a sting to it because he failed to believe. And now because he laughed at God when God said, I'm going to bring forth a son from your wife Sarah, even when she's old. And he laughed. And then later we know she laughed. And he said, well, you're going to name your son Isaac. Laughter. Reminds me so much of my failure to trust and believe in God. Verse 4. Then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah, by the way, that makes Sarah 90, just in case you forgot what the difference was between them. And Sarah said, God had made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me. And so now we have what started out as sarcasm has now turned to celebrating. Isn't that awesome? When you lay down your pride, and you confess and repent, and you know you were wrong, and God brings about the truth of what he had promised to do, even though you doubted. God brings it to pass. And not only will you laugh with rejoicing, but those around will laugh with you. Maybe once they were laughing at you. But if you stick to it, you trust the Lord, if you hang in there, continue to believe, He'll bring about His promises. And we'll go from sarcasm to celebrating. She also said, that is Sarah in verse 7, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? For I have borne him a son in his old age. Just absolutely blown away. She can't even believe it. And yet, she needs to learn to trust the Lord as well. So the child grew, and was weaned. Now you'll hear many people argue as to, when exactly the weaning process was complete in their culture. I've heard estimates, people saying, 12 years old, and, actually the most trustworthy information that we have about the culture at that time was that it was about 3 years old. So it was definitely longer than what, kids are weaned nowadays, but it was about 3 years old is the best we can tell, which would make Ishmael about 13 or 14 years old. It's going to be important that we know that. And so he was weaned, Isaac was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on that same day that Isaac was weaned. Interesting how important it was that day for Abraham. And yet we don't make all that big of a deal about this event now, do we? Instead, we make great feasts on, birthdays, But this is like a symbol of a child moving past his more vulnerable state to a state where they're more steady and more mature. They're able to eat solid food, and it's a sign of great growth. And now you're not so afraid of the vulnerability of a baby anymore, right? Because it's mature. And it's so funny because God's looking down at Abraham, and maybe there's a point at which God has a great feast because Abraham is weaned. That's the process, the spiritual process of consecration. Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, Ishmael, whom she had borne to Abraham, and she saw him scoffing. Now, you can kind of understand this a little bit because, as I said, Ishmael's probably about 14 years old at this point. There was about 10 years difference between the two. But, here he is. All his life, the attention and the focus has been on him. Right? Ishmael, that's my dad. Abraham's my dad. And I've been his son. And you'll see later, Abraham loved Ishmael. But what happens is now is the focus and the attention goes on to Isaac. And so there's jealousy. And so Ishmael is caught by Sarah to be scoffing or mocking the son of promise, the son of the flesh, and mocking the son of promise. And so Sarah recognizes something that Abraham doesn't. And that is that this is going to be a problem. Ishmael is going to be a problem because God has promised that the inheritance will be given to my son, not my maidservant's son. Now there's got to be some interesting duplicity in her mind and her heart here, because isn't Ishmael kind of her fault? Right? I mean, we never call children mistakes. We don't do that. Abraham loved Ishmael. And God actually provided for Ishmael and loved him too. Yet at the same time, there is a sense where Sarah has made a terrible error. And now the times that we're living today, as we turn on the news every day and we see, I watch Fox, I don't know which news you watch, but I see shots from the Gaza, and I see rockets being hurled into Israel, and a group of people called Hamas and Hezbollah and Ahmadinejad and all these different people who don't even believe Israel should be allowed to live as a nation, that they should be blown off the face of the earth as a race of people. Do you know who those people are? The descendants of Ishmael. They're the descendants of Ishmael. And so we have one of the greatest illustrations that in Christianity that you hear preached so often is don't go out and make Ishmaels. And not to be so mean to Ishmael, it wasn't his fault. But in a sense, he's a product of a fleshly decision. Remember, this is about consecration. Getting the world out of us, not getting us out of the world. Next time we get an idea where I think I need to help God get this done. Just remember Ishmael. Wait for the Lord to finish what He has promised to begin. Don't try to go ahead of Him. Verse 10, therefore Sarah said to Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely with Isaac. Notice she can't even call them by name. Keep in mind here that this Hagar must have been Sarah's closest friend, coming out of Egypt with her together. And now you have, this woman, and they've been so close, and she chose Hagar, chose Hagar of all the women that she had around her as the one who would bear this son that maybe would help God do this. Obviously, she had loved Hagar, and now she can't even use her name. Her mistake, Sarah's mistake, is quite stinging to her at this point. Now she sees that there's going to be tension between Ishmael and between Isaac, and she's afraid for Isaac, her son. This is all the consequences of her own sin. Turn to Galatians 4 for a second. Galatians 4, the Apostle Paul, in trying to make a point to the church at Galatia, a church which he had planted himself, a church that struggled with this very frustration of trying to overcome the flesh with the Spirit. And I don't know if you were here with us as a church, we went through Romans, but Romans chapter 7, 6, 7, and 8 really, but chapter 7 is really a description of the Apostle Paul talking about this great battle that we have as Christians between our flesh and our spirit. We have this tendency to want to fix things or do things in the flesh. Don't worry, Lord, I got this one. I don't need you on this. No need to pray. I've done this before. I can do this. Well, he says to them in verse 21 of chapter 4 in Galatians, he says, "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondwoman and the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and he of the free woman through promise, which things are symbolic, for these are two covenants. The one from Mount Sinai, which gives birth to bondage, which is Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to Jerusalem." By the way, notice how it says Arabia? The supposed site of Mount Sinai that you see in your maps in the back, it's probably not where it actually was. Arabia is actually on the other side of the Red Sea, so just make note of that. We believe it. Jebel al-Lawz is probably the actual site of Mount Sinai, but who knows? Anyway, and corresponds to Jerusalem, which now is and is in bondage with her children. But the Jerusalem is above is free, which is mother of us all. For it is written, "Rejoice, O barren, you who do not bear. Break forth and shout, you who are not in labor. For the desolation has many more children than she who has a husband." Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are children of promise. But as he who was born according to the flesh then persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, even so it is now. Nevertheless, what does Scripture say? "Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman." So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but children of the free. And the argument the Apostle Paul is making as he's referring back to this moment in history, which they're also familiar with, is, listen, if you want to be some of those who live according to the law, go ahead. But you're heading into a covenant of bondage. And it's bound to fail because you can't be freed from your sinful jail. God's not going to be able to consecrate you. God's not going to be able to sanctify you if you're living according to the law. And so often we do this. It's just our fleshly nature as we set up standards. And we read the Bible and we read, this is what God's best is, and this is what God wants for me. And how long should I read my Bible every day? And how long do I need to pray? And all these things. And we set up these standards. And we start to judge ourselves by them. Or we judge others by them. It's legalism. It's flesh. It's worldliness, actually. How much better is it to live according to the grace of God? Obtain salvation by faith. You obtain salvation by faith. Amen? We all know that verse. We're saved by grace through faith, not of works, lest anyone should boast. Ephesians chapter 4, right? We all know that. But really, it doesn't stop there. Consecration, sanctification is obtained the same way that salvation is. You are freed from the bondage of the worldliness that's in you according to grace, God's grace, by faith. It's something you believe in. It's something that you wait on God for and you pray for. It's the flesh versus the spirit. Sarah sees that Abraham hadn't yet saw it. He was clouded by his love for his son Ishmael. Notice this in verse 11. The matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son. He loved Ishmael. None of us holds that against him, and he should. But God said to Abraham, do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad, because of your bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice, hearken unto her voice, for in Isaac your seed shall be called. See, the Lord's not going to change his plans because of our fleshly mistakes. He wouldn't do it for Ishmael. Wouldn't do it for Sarah. He will be faithful, but we will suffer the consequences of bad choices often, won't we? We have to live with the consequences of our sin a lot of the time. You know what it's called when we don't live with the consequences of our sin? It's called mercy. Not receiving that which we justly deserve. Mercy. And yet, here we have that painfully we look as we see the consequences of their sin. Some say, well, it was Sarah's idea. You really can't blame Abraham. But you know what? Abraham could have said, no, this is wrong. He's the leader. He's more responsible than Sarah. They're both at fault. Look what happens as a result of this, verse 13. God has said to Abraham, do what Sarah said, cast out the bondwoman and her son. Yet, I will also make a nation out of the son of the bondwoman because he is your seed. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water, and putting it on her shoulder, he gave it and the boy to Hagar, and he sent her away. Then she departed and wandered into the wilderness of Beersheba. Now notice this, mark this change here. You can, if you're one who likes to underline things in the Bible, you can go ahead and underline this. And it says here in verse 14, so Abraham rose early in the morning. He got busy right away doing what God had told him to do. And I think if you notice as we go forward, you should see that this is more of a permanent change now. When God tells Abraham to do something from this point on, it's usually accompanied with an Abraham rose early the next morning and went ahead and did what God said to do. And there comes a point when there's enough world that God has gotten enough worldliness out of you, enough flesh out of you, and you're more dependent on his spirit, and you're more obedient, you're more able to trust, you're more able to walk in faith, that you're actually able to perform like this, where you rise early in the morning and you do as the Lord had said. Now this area where she's wandering, the wilderness of Beersheba, is that whole area around Sinai, just to the east of Sinai Peninsula there. And she's wandering out there. Now look what happens to her in verse 15. And the water in the skin was used up. And she placed the boy under one of the shrubs, and then she went and sat down across from him, a distance about a bow shot. For she said to herself, let me not see the death of the boy. She sat opposite him and lifted her voice and wept. And now here it's Hagar's turn to face very hard circumstances. Have you ever thought, I'm only a father of 4 years now, just over 4 years. But sometimes I lay awake at night and the fears that I hear, that I've heard many of you tell me about, before I was a father, that I've known you for years, and you've told me the things that scare you, keep you awake at night sometimes. When you think about your kids, how much you love them, and how much you stand in front of a bus to save, you know what I mean? You do nothing to let harm come to your children. And so much of your heart, and that's something, you know what, that's supernatural. That's something God does. He created us that way, so that we would protect our kids and love our kids, and we put them ahead of ourselves. Otherwise, we'd be putting ourselves ahead of them, That's what we would do. And as I think about the way that sometimes I lay awake and worry about my daughter, I can't help but imagine what's going on in Hagar's mind and her heart. She's done her very best to keep her son alive. Her son was born in very difficult circumstances, and now the father of her son has cast her out. And now she can't bear the sight of watching her own son, who, again, is about 14 years old here. Can't bear the sight of him wither away because of dehydration. And so she separates herself the distance of about a bow shot, so whatever an arrow could fly in that day, whatever kind of bow they could make, and they had some pretty good bows, but You got to figure this is probably at least 100 yards or so, or somewhere around 100 yards away. And she's separated herself so much so that she can't see him in his weakness, about to die because he had no water. Do you think sometimes you get focused on because you feel as though you've been treated unfairly? I know I do. I sometimes get my focus out of place, my nose out of joint, because I think I've been treated unfairly. Lord, how could you let people do this to me? How could you let this happen? But think about Hagar. Does she deserve this? God's allowing it. But look what God does with it. Look what God does with it. God heard the voice of the lad. Excuse me. The angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, "What ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is." And this is so comforting because the Lord just knows, doesn't he? He knows. He knows what you feel. He knows what your fears are. He knows what you think. He knows what's going to happen. He knows how he's going to deal with the problems. What our problem is I guess, sensing his closeness and trusting in him during these difficult times. Believing that he can do the unbelievable. What's ailing Hagar is deep disillusion, absolute confusion, and the thought that she is facing the most horrifying thing a mother could imagine. God knows, and God hears. No matter what your life is like right now, and no matter how hopeless and alone you may feel, God knows, and God hears. Does that comfort you? Comforts me. Isn't it hard sometimes how intangible God can seem? You know, we read about him, we talk to him, we have these little moments, these little milestones where we sense that he's spoken to us and things like that. But where is that when you're in Beersheba? When the waters run out? You know, when you're in the halting place, when you've been enclosed in and around you. Those feelings are gone. You just feel like you're in the desert all alone, right? But then when we look at this story, we find that God is doing a work in the midst of it. It's called consecration. God is taking worldliness and fleshliness out of us. He's preparing us for eternity, just like he's doing here for Abraham and Sarah. Now this is what he says. In her hopelessness, he says in verse 18, "Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him with your hand, for I will make him a great nation." Now God had already promised this, you remember, I think it was chapter 16, if I'm not mistaken. He had promised this. Obviously, Hagar must have given up on that promise, because at this point, she sees no reason to trust in it. Can you blame her? God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. The language here seems to indicate that the well was always there, but she couldn't see it. Boy, this sort of speaks to me about the times when I'm so frustrated and I can't see the well through the desert. And I need water. I'm so thirsty. I'm so dry. I feel like I'm at the end. Lord, I can't do this anymore. And God opens my eyes all of a sudden. Just when he's let me starve long enough, just when he's let me feel so apart from him long enough that I'm now ready to maybe trust him a little bit more and trust in myself a little bit less. And then he opens my eyes and lets me see the well. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the lad a drink. And so God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness, and he became an archer. So Ishmael became a hunter. And he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Now, I think this is a mistake. But I think what Hagar does is she goes back to what she's familiar with. She goes and she takes a wife for Ishmael from the land that she's familiar with. What were her choices? I don't know. Well, I'd like to think that maybe she could have went back to Abraham and said, of the women of your household, of the women of your village that are under your command, would you give to me one of these as a wife to your son, Ishmael? And I'd like to think that maybe he would have done that, and that maybe the descendants of Ishmael may have been different. But because he's half Egyptian, And Hagar takes an Egyptian wife for him, a polytheistic, godless, or not a godless, I mean false gods, the Egyptians at this point. But it sends his descendants further down a road, further away from God. So now we have the consequences of that. His descendants are now the greatest problem for God's people in the world, aren't they? Keep an eye on what's going on time-wise here. She saw the well of water. God gave them life. And she went and took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. That's our tendency too, isn't it? Is, we get through a hard time, sort of we immediately want to return to what we're familiar with. This would be a warning to us. These people become just what the Lord said they would, a great and a mighty nation of wild kicking mules and the greatest enemy Israel's ever known. And it came to pass at that time, that Abimelech, you remember Abimelech from last week? You remember from chapter 20? He's the king of the Philistines, dwelling in the land of Gerar. Now, remember we did talk about what Abimelech, the word Abimelech is actually not necessarily a proper name, although it is instead a title, like Pharaoh is a title. It just simply meant king. And so it's possible that this isn't the same guy. I tend to think it is, but here's, again, who I think is the same guy, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, and the commander of his army, this guy named Phicol, and he spoke to Abraham and he said, God is with you in all that you do. Interesting. Here's this worldly guy, this king of this, this worldly people, these non-believers, if you will, and he sees something in Abraham that scares him. He sees that this God who, now keep in mind, Abimelech at this point knows what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah and those plains up there. And I believe that he associates that destruction and that judgment with the same God of Abraham and his experience he had as we looked in chapter 20 last week. So he says, I see this, Abraham, I see that God, your God is with you in all that you do. And it seems that no matter what happens, God is blessing Abraham. Irregardless of what Abraham does, God is blessing him. And God has told Abimelech in a dream that Abraham's a prophet. So he knows that this God is with him. And so now Abimelech comes and he's wanting to protect himself and his posterity. He's worried about his own descendants. Keep in mind, Abimelech now, he's there with the captain of his army. He represents a much bigger nation of people than Abraham does. He's greater in wealth, he's greater in numbers. Abraham shouldn't represent a threat in any way to Abimelech except for one, his God. And as I thought about this, I thought, the people that go to our church at Jersey Shore Calvary, when they're out there at work in the middle of the week, when they're out there in their families and they're relating to people who don't know the Lord, do those people see God in their lives like Abimelech saw God in Abraham's life? And I said, Lord, that's what I want. That's what I want for the people that go to our church. I want people to look at them and say, there's something different. They're not perfect people, just like Abraham wasn't perfect. But you know what? They don't present themselves to me. They're humble. There's a power there. There's a love there that's different. And Abimelech does the right thing. He goes and he tries to make a covenant with Abraham. Look at this, verse 23. Now swear to me, verse 23. Swear to me by your God, by God, that you will not deal falsely with me. And he's got good reason to ask that question, because Abraham lied to him, as we remember from chapter 20, right? And with my offspring, or with my posterity, but that according to the kindness that I have done to you, you will do to me and the land in which you have dwelt. He knows that Abraham's God is more powerful than any of the gods he's ever known. And so he wants to find himself on the right side of this particular God. Not just for himself, but he's concerned about his own children and his own descendants as well. And so Abraham says, I will swear. Then Abraham, listen to this, he rebukes Abimelech because of the well of water which Abimelech's servants had seized. He was well-jacked. A drive-by well-jacking. They came by and stole his well. Obviously, just from the story we heard with Hagar, owning a well, digging a well, it was of critical importance to your survival. Without a well, you died. living in this region. And so Abraham and his men and his people had dug a well, and apparently, according to the story, Abimelech's men had seized it. It was of great value, this well. Now Abimelech says, and this sounds familiar to last week, I do not know who's done this thing. You did not tell me, nor had I heard of it until today. Remember last week? Lord, you know my heart. I didn't know this woman was married. She told me that she was Abraham's sister. And the man, he also told me the same thing. Whether Abimelech's actually telling the truth or not here, we don't know. But, he portrays himself as innocent again. And he may well be. But he agrees, this is the most important thing, he agrees to make the wrong right. Make the wrong right. And I think that's interesting how the power of the living God can even affect unsaved people to do the right thing and to make their wrongs right. And that's a step in the right direction. Verse 27. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two of them made a covenant. And Abraham set the 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. Then Abimelech asked Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs which you have set by themselves? And he said, you will take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, that they may be a witness that I have dug this well. And this basically completed the contract or the covenant. And it was sealed by the gift of these lambs as they agreed together. And as Abimelech possessed these lambs, they would serve as a reminder. Because where did I obtain these ewe lambs from? Well, it was an agreement I made with Abraham that well was dug by his people and he owns it. And the evidence is there to suggest that he agreed and believed in that. Verse 31, therefore he called that place Beersheba, because the two of them swore an oath there. Thus they made a covenant at Beersheba. So Abimelech rose with the commander of his army, Phicol, and they returned to the land of the Philistines. And then Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And this is, by the way, the first place in the scriptures that this title for God is used, the everlasting God, which speaks of his eternal existence. God not having any beginning and not having any end. And this is the first time that appears here, so you might want to note that as well. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines for many days. God is at work in Abraham, as we've seen. God's doing a consecrating work, a work where he's taking the worldliness out of Abraham. He's not so much worried about taking Abraham out of the world. In fact, just the opposite. Here he has brought Abraham, or allowed Abraham, to come to a worldly place and live amongst worldly people, so that he could bring about a worldly change inside of Abraham, pulling the worldliness and the fleshliness out of him. They had made decisions in their past. They had made compromises in their past that were affecting them now. God had to preserve his covenant through Abraham and Sarah, and in order to do that, he needed to consecrate him. So now they're dwelling in the halting place around the city of Gerar. They're been encamped about by God, so that God can consecrate them. Next week in chapter 22, we're going to see some passages that we're probably well familiar with, most of us, I would think, where this new son that they have, this son of promise, where God really wants to show Abraham the character that he's creating inside of him. Character is proven. Character is shown when we see what we do when no one's looking. And Abraham has that opportunity. As he goes off, God tells him, I want you to take your son, your only son, Isaac. Interesting, God says your only son, Isaac. And I want you to take him to a place that I'm going to show you, and I want you to sacrifice him to me. What a hard thing they'll face up to next week. Go ahead and read up on that chapter in preparation for next week. Let's all stand and pray. Worship team, make your way forward. Try to find there's new words that are introduced to in this next chapter too that you'll find interesting.